kind of like how my dad's afraid of chickens because they can fly. Their angle of attack is from a third dimension that we as humans just can't account for.
Exactly like that.
Yeah, he's afraid of chickens.
Shat on TV Watchmen, the unofficial podcast companion piece to the hit HBO series Watchmen. I'm one of your hosts, Gene Lyons, and alongside me are my two co-hosts, the King Bee,
Crookshank's Booty,
and Roger Roeper.
A friend tells me that I have a profound lack of imagination.
And this is, at long last, our deep dive edition where we look back on this week's episode of Watchmen and provide our thoughts and analysis. This week's episode was episode 8, A God Walks into a Bar. King B, you weren't with us for the Instacast that we released last night. I'm glad you're with us tonight. What'd you think?
Man, I'm going to get a lot of internet hate for this. We were definitely running for cover as a result of our episode 7 review. I got to tell you, this episode still just kind of left me wanting more. Listen, the performances are fantastic. The plot is superb. We couldn't ask for a better story to get us to this point. Every reveal has really settled nicely. It's a well-crafted piece of work. But I got to tell you guys, I'm just burnt out on seeing what was, and I want more of what's going to be. I mean, Jesus, a double-digit percentage of this show is flashbacks and background, and that's fine. It's beautiful, it's interesting, and it's fascinating. But for me alone, it's starting to tap dance on becoming long-winded. We've just got one episode left, and I feel we're in for this clusterfuck of activity. Before all you nerds start tweeting at me, I know that I'm wrong. I'm just sharing one man's opinion.
Well, that makes me particularly glad that you joined us then, because Raj and I were gushing over this episode in the Instacast. That seems to be the prevailing thought on Twitter. But for those people who did not appreciate this episode in particular, or thought it wasn't as good as, say, episode 7, a lot of them are having the similar complaint that it's not moving forward enough, that we're left with too many things to wrap up. As Lindelof has said, this is going to be a self-enclosed season of Watchmen. So even if there is anything that comes in the future, it's not going to be focused on answering the questions of this season. Therefore, I think it's a valid complaint. I don't necessarily share it. I think that chaos is going to solve for a lot of these things. But I'm glad you're here to represent that side of the story. Raj, you've now had 24 hours since the Instacast to digest more of episode 8. What do you think now?
Yeah, I completely enjoyed this episode the more I sat on it and rewatched for a second time. You know, I mentioned on the Instacast that Kelly watched the Zack Snyder version last night after we finished the episode. And I watched a little of it with her, and even watching the movie gave me even more of appreciation for the writing of this episode. I talked about how on the Instacast, the character of Dr. Manhattan is extremely difficult to write for. And when you compare this episode against the Zack Snyder version, I feel that we've received at least a far deeper, more accurate depiction of Dr. Manhattan that I believe is most closely resembles what Alan Moore was trying to go for with the character. And for that's why I really enjoyed this episode.
Now, again, I've just got to jump in and clarify. They did everything right. It's fine. It's a great episode of TV. It's just at this point, I feel like I'm experiencing a little bit of burnout. Please don't yell at me, internet.
I'm still in the camp after 24 hours of loving this episode. In fact, I forgot to mention something I really, really liked about the episode. We were so excited last night talking about these concepts that were presented about Dr. Manhattan, about Adrian Veidt, that I forgot to mention the action in the show really picked up in this episode. And I really appreciated that. King B, you're saying that the story's not moving that far forward. Totally agree. But at least the pace quickened a little bit. When Angela busted out the guns to take on the 7th Cavalry, I literally exclaimed, "Oh shit, it's on." Like, Regina King did a thrilling job on this suicide mission and added some needed zip to a very cerebral episode. We've had 7 episodes prior to this where this anger toward the 7th Cavalry is steaming, where you're really upset with all these powers that are bearing down on this woman who's just trying to live her fucking life, and letting her unleash a little bit on that, especially those close range shots to people's heads, knowingly going on the suicide mission was really satisfying for me. It added some needed zip to a very cerebral episode, and I wanted to just take a moment to applaud Watchmen for that. So typically on the deep dive, we go into buckets rather than going scene by scene to cover an episode. And usually you're looking at like 3, 4, maybe 5 buckets that we're going to talk about, big themes or big things that we learned from the episode. In this case, the episode really focused on 4 or 3 characters, depending on how you look at it. So you've got Cal, Abar, or John Osterman, Dr. Manhattan, as 2 or 1 character, depending on how you decide to look at it. And we're going to get really into that because we learned a lot about Dr. Manhattan. As Roger pointed out, we know a lot about Dr. Manhattan from Alan Moore's work on the graphic novel, but I think Watchmen did an effective job as a TV show telling us even more about this character, rounding him out a little bit, and I'm glad they did. I'd like to go into that. And then Roger is going to do his favorite thing in the world, which is turn a TV show into the Bible with his biblical allegories and what it means to be a god. And the show wouldn't be complete without the King Bee explaining what we saw in the post-credit scene. A lot of people tweeted at us and wrote in and said, hey guys, you forgot on the Instacast to talk about the post-credit scene. That's what the deep dive is here for, so we didn't get to everything. So it was critical. We did remind people to go back and watch it. Now that maybe you've had a chance to see it, King Bee is going to pick that apart and get into the guts of what it all means, and also some observations and questions that he has. And finally, we'll finish it off with some odds and ends, just some things that we wanted to get to that don't really fit neatly into any other category. So we'll have those on the pod as well. And if you hear anything on the podcast that you want to talk about, we will have the newsstand later this week. You can write into us at host@shatontv.com or call us at 914-719-SHAT and share your ideas via voicemail. We're going to start, though, with Dr. Manhattan, what this episode told about him, and really to clarify some misconceptions I think that are floating around on the internet. Gentlemen, feel free at any time to jump in on any of these and let me know your thoughts if I'm getting something wrong or if you have something to add to it. But I want to start out with the first thing that this episode established, which cleared up a big question I had, which was, how did Cal survive the White Knight? Now, Angela, during the White Knight, when we see the flashback to it, she's pinned down, she's shot. Next thing we know, she wakes up in the hospital. We don't know how the hell she survived that night. We thought for a while maybe Judd Crawford got involved. We thought for a while that maybe Cal intervened in some normal way, but that's kind of weird that part of the story was never told. And we'd kind of ruled out Cal doing anything super heroic because we thought that would have been a dead giveaway. Like Dr. Manhattan would have been unmasked if Cal decided to go blue glowy and save the day. Now we learn that Adrian Veidt showed he wasn't the worst guy in the world by leaving a loophole in the ring device that actually allows Dr. Manhattan's powers to be unleashed in an act of self-defense without Cal being conscious of that fact. How it works, we don't know. But it explains how Cal survived without the secret being revealed to him or the audience.
It's definitely very much a comic book mechanic in the way that it's presented. I'm not complaining. It moves the story forward in the sense that when it is presented, there is no explanation asked, none really needed. You're just meant to sort of suspend that disbelief.
I just like the fact that they explain it and not just leave this open for interpretation.
And they did a lot of explaining this episode that I appreciated. Like, even if it didn't make 100% sense, you could at least believe it with a little bit of faith. Another thing we learned about Dr. Manhattan, where I was profoundly wrong on episode 7's recap, is that he can feel. Dr. Manhattan, we often think of him as unfeeling or overly logical, but he does have feelings and he's quite sentimental. That's shown throughout the graphic novel, and it's echoed even more strongly in the TV series. If everything is the present for Dr. Manhattan, he's feeling everything all the time. Now, maybe like the King Bee watching this series, he's a little burnt out, but he's forever in that moment of the intrinsic field chamber being disintegrated and being afraid of that moment coming. He can feel that dating someone who knows everything that's going to happen is impossible. Like, he gets that from being with Angela. He's not completely unaware of the people around him. And it hurts him to lose Angela. He takes the actions that he takes in order to be with her. That's emotionally motivated. You even see that with the manner that he teleported to Europa. He's told, well, couldn't you just make something there? Why'd you have to teleport this thing from Earth? Well, he had to teleport it because that there's a sentimentality there. That's the manner he grew up in. It's what gave him comfort. So he had to take it there. And he even, models this entire life bubble on Europa over this terrarium, this life jar that he sees inside the manor. So this guy doesn't just make things in the most scientific way possible or the most efficient way possible. There is a sentimentality and a humanness that exists there.
Like the King Bee said, I think the only problem I have with the fact that he can feel is that he can't feel the strap over his ears of the mask. He just leaves it on like that.
The whole episode, he's got that strap over his ears.
And that brings me to a point that I really, really need to clarify. And several people on Twitter have been using the term time travel. That if Dr. Manhattan is time traveling, that if he's going from one place to another in time, how is this possible? And how is he going back and forth so quickly? And why wouldn't he go back and change the past and all that stuff? He's not time traveling. He is at all times at once. And I was trying to think of a way to an analogy that would help explain this. What came to mind was like a CB radio. So if I've got a CB radio and King B's got a CB radio and Rod's got a CB radio, or maybe even the podcast like right now, your voice can be in a ton of places at the same time. You could be hearing voices from afar at the same time, but it doesn't mean you're physically in that place. And it doesn't mean that one thing comes before another, right? So if you think about it from the perspective of a broadcast that's going out, it's all at the same time, but in different places. Now you just need to extend that up one dimension. So it's all at the same time to Dr. Manhattan. He's not going from one spot to another. He's in all the places at the same time. So he's not going back and forth. He's not Marty McFly. He's not deciding, I got to go back and save time. He can't go back in time. He's in that time all the time.
And this is the most difficult part of the Watchmen comic to read, is that when it gets to the Dr. Manhattan, they're trying to show that he's experiencing all these moments at once. When he's arguing with Jeannie, he's also experiencing, another event that happened with Jeannie. Or when he's arguing with Laurie, he's also arguing with Jeannie. So people who, like you said, who are comparing this to Hodor or the Three-Eyed Raven or all that shit, just know that this came first. This idea of I can be anywhere at any given time, all experiencing it at the present, that's Dr. Manhattan. That's who his character is. And no other version of Dr. Manhattan outside of the comic books has, I think, nailed it, with the exception of this past episode.
If the CB radio analogy didn't work for you, here's another one that might. And this speaks to why he can't change the future. A lot of people have said, well, he knows what's going to happen. Why doesn't he do something about it? Imagine there's a being that only lives in two dimensions, right? They can go left, right, back, forward. They have no concept of up or down. They can't move that. So if you have a drawing, right, on a piece of paper, that drawing can't come out. But you can look at the drawing and see two dimensions, and you can see a third dimension that's available to you, but not to that being there, right? So just because you can see all that doesn't mean you can do anything about it. It's there. So he doesn't have a pencil. He just has a view that's different than ours.
It's kind of like how my dad's afraid of chickens because they can fly. Their angle of attack is from a third dimension that we as humans just can't account for.
Exactly like that.
Yeah, he's afraid of chickens.
Dr. Manhattan is a puppet, although he's a puppet that can see the strings. For those who saw The Matrix, he's Neo. He can see the code, but he can't prevent what's happening to him. It's going to happen no matter what.
Yeah, in order to prevent something from happening, that something would have to be in the future. If you don't have a future, then you can't prevent something from happening. That's how it works. And that brings me to the death, the way Dr. Manhattan sees death. Now, I read the graphic novel. I saw the 2009 Watchmen movie, and I enjoyed both. And both touched on Dr. Manhattan and his view of life and death. But just like Roger said, until episode 8, I didn't really have a full understanding of Dr. Manhattan's relationship with death. It took me to a new level of understanding and brought me kind of a little comfort in the process. And what's funny is they don't even explicitly mention death to do it. But Jeff Jensen and Damon Lindelof's writing team, what they did was they probed what time means to Manhattan and what existence means to Manhattan. And as a byproduct, you get this understanding that if all time exists at once for a being, then nobody is actually ever dead. They're just over there. It's like if Raj was just in another room, you could still go over. He's right there, right? So that got me thinking. I was like, maybe it's a nice thought that if that's what death is, it's an illusion of non-existence that's created by the misunderstanding that time must always go forward. So to Dr. Manhattan, his first love, she's still there. He's still with Laurie. He's with Angela. He's still with his father. All the things that exist are there at the same time. So no one really dies to him. So when you think that, he's callous toward death, well, death is only this ceasing to exist in a certain time frame. Therefore, everyone's still around.
And in the comic book and in the movie, he talks about that. He says, well, when he's talking about Wally, his best friend that recently dies of cancer, he's like, well, biologically, they're the same. Whether he's alive or dead, it's the same amount of atoms and molecules that make up that body. But exactly the way that he perceives his existence is that he is living with everyone that he's ever encountered at one time, the present, what we perceive as the present. So no one ever really truly dies.
So if you take a minute and you imagine the greatest feeling or the greatest experience you've ever had in your life, the happiest moment you ever knew, and it's all behind us now, of course, it's no longer around us, but that doesn't mean that it is any less real than it once was. And imagine a person with PTSD and how they react to external factors that maybe aren't existing now, but still are very real and creating a psychological and physiological effect on them constantly. Maybe Dr. Manhattan's what we view as a detachment or a sort of an aloofness or an indifference to the human condition is just feeling every emotion all at once for the entirety of a lifetime. It's a fucking bummer.
It is a bummer. And speaking of bummers, there's one thing I really need to clear up. If you take nothing away from this episode, from anything I say, please focus on this. There are listeners who walked away from episode 8 thinking that episode 8 means Will Reeves didn't do any work on his own. And I think Alan Swanson is one of those people. And Alan's a longtime listener, very smart guy. And if he was wrong on this, I think a lot of people need this clarification. Will Reeves was not robbed of his agency and his contributions as a hero because of Dr. Manhattan. Will Reeves was hooded justice before Dr. Manhattan ever met him. Like, he did all that Cyclops shit on his own. He uncovered Cyclops on his own. He fought on his own. He even killed Judd Crawford himself. Manhattan simply introduced the name Judd Crawford to Will in 2009 before Angela placed the ring in Dr. Manhattan's head. So to clarify, Dr. Manhattan didn't tell Will Reeves to go crack down Cyclops or to uncover this insidious conspiracy in New York. He gave him a name, and Will Reeves did the rest on his own. And also, just because Judd Crawford's name was passed by Dr. Manhattan to Will Reeves doesn't mean that Crawford's off the hook. Like, remember, his wife is still involved in this conspiracy. It's reasonable to believe he might have been too.
Yeah, I blame Angela completely on this, because all she has to say to Dr. Manhattan is say, hey, you know that thing that I said? Can you do your thing where you're talking to Will Reeves and just say that, listen, completely forget Judd Crawford. He's a good guy. I love him. And he's not his granddaddy. He's a good guy. His wife, though, go kill his wife.
Yeah, I didn't even think about that. Raj, you could get your ass in the writing room.
I'm in.
You could have solved this whole problem.
You know, fun fact, you mentioned Jeff Jensen, who is the writing partner on this episode. Jeff Jensen was the most well-known contributor to Lost recaps when Lost was going on, so much that Lindelof reached out to him and asked him to be a writer on Watchmen. This Jensen guy was a past version of Shat on TV.
Fun fact. King B, you mentioned how John Osterman wasn't trying to punish Adrian Veidt by putting him on Europa.
Yeah, I really hit the nail on the head for a lot of this stuff, I think.
Yeah. Well, I do believe that. There might have been some prison aspect to it, in the sense that if John knows he's going to be taking a 10-year trip down the tunnel of love, maybe having Adrian not on Earth was a good idea. Like, Adrian being Adrian, he might have some new and potentially catastrophic scheme. So before going under, maybe you just put him on Europa where he can't hurt anybody.
I don't really think it's that. I think it's more like when you park your car at my house and go to the airport, but you forget to leave your keys with me. And, something needs to move the car and it just doesn't work out. I think it was just, as uncharacteristic as this is going to be, considering the last hour of conversation we just had, I think it was a lack of foresight on Dr. Manhattan's part to really consider Adrian Veidt's needs. The fact of the matter is, he wouldn't have known what Veidt was going through because at the time, he didn't have that ability to see those things. So it's just kind of one of those accidents. It's a mishap.
To go along with that, I actually tend to believe that he was rewarding his friend or colleague. I really think that he thought this was the best thing for Ozymandias, for Adrian Veidt.
I don't know if it's necessarily such a direct thing. I think that these are two characters that have a similar goal and a slightly different skill set to get about to that goal. I think it was sort of like almost like, hey, this is what I've been doing. You want to go check it out for a while? And giving the guy a taste of what he's working towards,
So it's like a couple of swingers just exchanging wives. Hey, you want to experience this for a little bit?
I would say it was two skilled craftspeople exchanging trade secrets.
There you go.
Speaking of swingers, I want to get into some sexual issues here really quickly, though. There was a tiny reveal, I thought, and I might be misinterpreting this, but when John Osterman, Dr. Manhattan, shows up in Veidt's stronghold, and he's naked and he's black, Veidt's question is, what's her name? And to me, that suggests that Manhattan has some love problems. He has some romantic predilections. And if you think about it, this makes sense, actually, because look at his past. So Crookshanks and Phillips are modeled after this couple that John sees banging at the manor as he's spying on them. And this is like his introduction to love. And they give him this, reinforcing message that this is what people do. This is a good thing. This is what people do when they love each other. They give him his first Bible and they teach him about Genesis. That's a big swirl in a kid's head. And then take it a step further, and we learn in this episode that John's mother ran away with an SS officer. So here we have this mother abandonment, learning about love by seeing people having sex, get a Bible laid on you. I could see for a kid where this might create some sexual issues that you're working through. And also you're a demigod.
You see this in the original story in Watchmen, the fact that his first taste of true love with Janie, his first girlfriend, or what we assume is his first girlfriend, it ends tragically soon after they hook up or they have sex for the first time. You also see that he's having troubles pleasing Janie because he's so distracted as he becomes more and more this godlike creature. Now, I think, though, what Ozzy is alluding to is the last time that John came back to Earth was for Laurie. He saw the pain in Laurie. He saw the connection and the love for Laurie and how humanity is, all these random events really is what binds us together. And he said, well, that's interesting to me. I'm going to come back and save humanity based upon you coming here and pleading for it. So the last time that he came back was for Laurie. So it makes sense that the next time that he would come back would also be for a girl.
I think the big dysfunction here is that the guy was never given a framework for the maintenance that relationships take. The first time he sees two people making love, it is, as he describes it, pure joy. You didn't get to see a courtship. You didn't get to see fights. When they explain what he's seen, it's this oversimplified explanation of, oh, we're making a life. His first relationship ends as the woman he's with is kind of getting older and she's maybe a little bit more demanding of reassurance and things in the relationship. And he just doesn't have the emotional inventory to really invest in that portion of the relationship. He's attracted to this bright and shiny young thing. It's a new form of energy to him that he's drawn to. And when that thing starts to become a regular humdrum relationship, it's where he begins to fail again. It's that emotional maintenance of the mundane that he just cannot identify or relate to. So, when does he come back? I don't think it's necessarily out of real genuine feeling or sentiment. She's in a moment of crisis and she's screaming like this is a terrible moment that John comes back to Earth. It's like you would never think to just take out the trash on your own. You need this crisis fight to take place for you to actually show up and do the maintenance that you're supposed to do. So I think that his big dysfunction is he's just not willing to do the maintenance work that's required.
Now, my next point is perhaps the most convoluted, so bear with me. And this is about how memory works for John. And I'm putting memory in quotes here because we understand that the ring is sort of a memory wiping device. And there's a lot of questions swirling around how the hell that worked. So when Dr. Manhattan comes out of Cal's shell after his head gets cracked, the question was like, will he need things explained to him when Angela springs him from the tunnel of love, right? And there's a reason why he doesn't, because Cal begins forming new memories the moment the ring is inserted. All the ring did was make 2009 Cal forget John's life before the ring. You can almost see it as like a metaphor for marriage, right? So in order to have a successful marriage, you need to forget everything that came before, like everybody you banged, all the weird shit you did, like none of that matters, right? It's a fresh start. That's what that ring is doing for him. Now this one's hard to understand if you have a linear concept of time. And unfortunately, all of us do. Because logically, as soon as Cal went back to being John, the memories of being Cal would be in John's consciousness. And since John exists at all times, those memories would be passed back to John in the past. So he would know those 10 years, right? But John says he can't see those 10 years because you have to remember, John is always in now. So no matter what time he is, the ring is always still there from 2009 to 2019, right? So the way to think about it is Cal can have a memory. He can tell the past. John cannot. He always has a present. So the memories actually simultaneously exist and don't exist because Cal has them and John doesn't. John just has now.
I would imagine that his initial disorientation when he arrives is him parsing through everything that's happened over the last 10 years now that this device has been taken away. He's got a lot of ground to cover.
But that's just it. He can never remember that time, but he also knows what happened during that time, which is to say that Cal had a memory, and in the moment that he's sprung, he understands that memory, but John that can't have memory. He only exists in now. Therefore, there's no past to him.
What would you pay to see a television show where Dr. Manhattan discusses life experiences with Russ Cole from True Detective?
It'd be amazing.
Time is a flat circle.
So basically, this isn't like coming out of a 10-year blackout where I need someone to explain to me all the dumb shit that I did for those 10 years while I was blacked out?
Right. Nothing like that. Now, the show's done a great job explaining the complexity of being Dr. Manhattan. And it sounds like a lot of downers when it comes to, memory. Like what's the upside here? And I think there is something beautiful that they do with it. They actually use this paradox to show something beautiful. And that's why Dr. Manhattan falls in love with Angela. Because I'm asking that as he's at the bar and he takes 2 beers over to her. I'm like, okay, we get that he loves her and that's why he did all this stuff, but why? And the episode's going on and I'm being an asshole. I'm like, why? But why? So what? And, he says he saw her, he was attracted to the emptiness and loss. I'm like, so you're fucking weird, but like, why? And then we see it that 10 years after they meet, at the moment of tragedy, when the chips are down, he knows he's going to be caught. He knows it's inevitable. She goes against the odds, against the impossible, and defends him. And that's what makes him fall in love with her. Because to him, whether it's 2019 or 2009 when they first meet, it's all the same moment. And so you can fall in love with somebody for what they do in 10 years.
Yeah, I feel like Dr. Manhattan and I have similar attractions for females in that we're always looking for the broken individuals. We're always looking for the ones that need some sort of fulfilling in life, or they got something broken. With Lori, it was her father was the one who raped their mother, and she grew up in a household where a lot was demanded of her, and she really didn't feel like her own individual. And it wasn't until she broke away and became her own woman that he was attracted to her. And then once she was her own woman, he was like, yeah, I have no need for this world anymore, until he finds that next broken individual, which is Angela Abar. Is that what we're supposed to believe?
It did happen in a sense when his first wife started aging and stuff, and then he took notice of Lori. But remember as well that this is a guy who's never accepted for what he is. You know, I think that's why he's so cautious with Angela as well, is that he knows that it's never going to work out, because people always think it's cool to date Dr. Manhattan until you actually have to date Dr. Manhattan. And you realize that, like, you can't have an argument with him. He's always going to know what you're going to say next. He's going to rationalize everything. Like, who wants to be with that?
Which is why I think that this plan that Angela comes up with, he feels is so ingenious. If he doesn't know he's Dr. Manhattan, then maybe truly for the first time he can experience love, when he's not the focal point.
And that brings us to the focal point of the show. Now, across blogs and Twitter and email that we've received, people have said it is late in the game to be switching gears on this TV show, making it about Dr. Manhattan. Why is it about Dr. Manhattan? It's not. Lindelof has explicitly said Angela is the sun and all other characters are orbiting her. And that includes Dr. Manhattan. His appearance in the show and his immense power did not make him the focal point. He's a man in her life, not the other way around. This show is still about Angela, and I guarantee you will see that in episode 9. And listener Dave in Des Moines wrote in how he thinks the show will drive its way back to Angela as the key figure. He said, you mentioned in the Instacast that people think Dr. Manhattan is going to pass on his powers to Sister Night. It took me a little bit, but it finally sunk in, and the clues are obvious. And it centers on a single question. Why the fuck would Dr. Manhattan be making waffles? As John is getting his bearings again, he makes sure to have a conversation with Angela while walking on the surface of the pool. And he even tells her it's important for her to see him walking on the water. Well, if you think back to the bar when they met and it's discovered that John could pass on his powers, Angela says something to the effect of, you can do something to this egg, and if I eat it, I could walk on water. I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact quote, but I'm tired and I'm about to go to sleep. Well, while Dr. Manhattan is making waffles, he deliberately reminds Angela about eggs and floats them in front of her when he just as easily could have teleported them out of the fridge or created them out of thin air like he did at the bar. I believe that while Angela starts the gunfight with the 7th Cavalry, John is finishing making waffles that Angela will discover when she re-enters her house to regroup. And she will piece together the importance of a well-balanced breakfast that will turn you into a godlike being. Love the podcast. Keep up the good work. Dave in Des Moines, Iowa.
Lego My Ego brand waffles.
Look, I don't want to make predictions, but this is about as good as an explanation as I've ever heard. And it's funny that in all of the thinking I was doing about this episode, the two things I never focused on was why he's out walking on the pool and he's like, hey, look at me. I'm walking on the pool. But basically, we've got that and the waffle making scene, and I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. That's where he was during the fight. And it really lends to, if you're a being that thinks like Dr. Manhattan, not like you or me would be like, well, I better go fucking help her. I better get a gun and, go zap some people. What's more important, that, or if you know you're going to be captured, passing on something to another character? Again, not saying it's going to happen, but it's a reasonable guess.
Are we saying that this is an instance where he was in two places at once? He needed her to see him out on the water so she would go to him, meanwhile his second self is possibly making the waffles, because waffles aren't like an instant treat.
No, but that's the thing. He's making the waffles while she's out fighting the 7th Cavalry. He doesn't just show up and start zapping people. That's what he's doing during those minutes.
I just can't wait for Ego to jump on this, and kind of like what they did with Stranger Things, and just brand, blue waffles as the next thing to buy in your grocer's freezer aisle.
I can totally wait.
All right. Well, that's what I've got for Dr. Manhattan. And thanks so much, Dave in Des Moines, for writing in. Thank you guys for your patience as I try to explain things from the philosophical to the metaphysical. Raj, I'd like to pass it to you for your massive chunk of content for tonight's podcast.
One thing that I talked about in the Instacast is all these allegories, all these allusions to biblical tales and what it means to be a god. And so I thought I'd dive into that a little bit. The first thing that we see here is John Osterman, at least in the series, is Jewish, or at least he's half Jewish. We have to, I guess, assume that his mother was not, if she's going to go run off with an SS officer. Now, when you think of expulsion of Jewish individuals from their homeland, there's a lot of stories of that are in the Bible. And we also know that there's one, savior of the world that was Jewish. Now, this is different in the comics. In 1939, the comics explain that his family decided to secretly leave Germany before they apprehended his Jewish mother. So he was fully Jewish in the comics. John was hidden inside a box for market goods. It was almost like that similar story that we see a young Will Reeves, where they're trying to escape. The mother runs away and kind of distracts SS Nazi guards that are hot on their trail and is eventually shot while the father and he escape. There's, again, similarities in just introducing the idea that John Osterman is a Jewish figure. Now, in terms of similarities between the story of Jesus Christ and that of Dr. Manhattan, there's a lot. The first of many is crucifixion, or the way that crucifixion is drawn and what we imagine of that. Gibbons and Moore depict the moment of John Osterman's death in the test chamber in a visually iconic way. The legs are straight up and down, very similar to Christ, and the iconic features of the arms extended are also in a very cross-like way. So this, in most visual situations, especially within Western society, almost always refers to the cross and crucifixion. And two more things add to this theory and train of thought. The first is John's death and rebirth as this new individual, Dr. Manhattan, is very similar to the way that Jesus died. 3 days later, he rose from the grave and ascended into heaven. And he didn't become the Christ until the moment of his death. Very similar to Dr. Manhattan. And in the comic books and movie, he gradually reduces his clothing. At first, when he's this superhero power and being used by the government, he wears almost like a black onesie. Then as he's going through and starting, when he's fighting in Vietnam, it's shrunk down to just like a bikini. And then after Vietnam, when he's working and he's at home with Lori, when he's working in the Gila River facility, he's no longer wearing clothing. And then when he returns back from Mars, he doesn't even care. In fact, in this episode, when he goes to Ozymandias' lair, he doesn't wear any clothes. And that nakedness symbolizes his loss of humanity and human identity.
This is also the transition that our friends would go through when they become yoga guys.
That's right.
Like, it starts off, I'm just going to wear my sweats. I'm going to yoga. And then it's like, I'm going to wear just some like Lululemon tights. And then it's like, I'm going to wear my yoga shorts. And then they're just like, fuck it, naked yoga.
That's right.
Granolas.
In this episode and in the book, they both showcase how also Dr. Manhattan can walk on water. And Jesus was, again, in the Bible shown as that he could also walk on water. So I think this is also depicts both Dr. Manhattan as a savior and the fact that there's nothing human about him, much like in the series. And Manhattan, what I find interesting about this whole concept is most people assume that Dr. Manhattan is the only God that we're seeing, or the only biblical allegory, when in actuality, Adrian Veidt is also a savior. His crucifixion is symbolic of the sacrifice that he made to ensure world peace by dropping a giant squid in the middle of downtown Manhattan. He didn't sacrifice himself, but he did have the fate of the world in mind when he doomed 3 million New Yorkers to their death. So he's a Christ figure in the sense that his purpose was to save others, and he made an enormous sacrifice to do that. He killed his friends, he killed people around him. He did everything in his power to get to that point. In fact, when Lori shoots him, both in the comics, and you can see this in the movie, it's a little bit better in the comics, it's not so much in the movie, he catches a bullet. When that panel is shown in the comic books, there's blood, and it looks eerily stigmatic, corresponding to the crucifixion wounds of Jesus Christ.
I'm going to challenge you here, because at the moment this assassination attempt takes place and you get that sort of stigmata thing, he hasn't completed his plan. And you'll recall that it's also just kind of a ruse that he had planned himself anyway. He's not really the Christ figure that you're making him out to be. I understand that you could kind of loosely make a connection. To me, it's less of like a religious sort of deliverance here. And it's more of just, here's a guy who understands what he's got to do to get his plan into play. The crucifixion, I just don't see it. I mean, if anything, maybe he's sort of like going through the motions. I just don't feel this Jesus correlation between Ozymandias and the rest of this story.
Well, at the very least, you would agree with me, though, that he had a savior-like complex. And that's being depicted in the art and in the actions.
I mean, he kind of viewed himself as a king among men. But that's just more of a vanity thing than anything else. And that's not really the nature of what Christ was all about.
I think that gets to my point, which is, why does this all matter? Why am I even going to the depths of this? I think it's because both men are portrayed by Moore and by Lindelof as gods. Now, you could say that Dr. Manhattan is almost as close to a literal god as we'll have, in the fact that he has powers, real genuine powers to create life on other worlds. Whereas maybe Ozymandias is a man who has a savior-like complex and is trying to play God. In the comics, John becomes burdened. John, this truly superhuman God, becomes burdened by the pettiness and selfish nature of mankind. And as spoken in this episode in the bar, he tries to become a symbol of something greater, a savior. He tries to do what he thinks is right by taking action in Vietnam or working with Veidt to create sustainable energy. But ultimately, he becomes disenfranchised. He becomes bored by the pettiness over all of mankind and leaves Earth to be in solitude. And it takes Dr. Manhattan being amazed by those improbable chances that occurred to result in the birth of Laurie, which he sees as a stunning, and I quote here, thermodynamic miracle. And by extension, this miracle can apply to any living thing on Earth. And so Dr. Manhattan is reintroduced to this concept that maybe life on Earth does matter, and I should protect humanity rather than just disregarding it as insignificant.
I guess where we differ is that I don't see that these two men are representatives gods. One is a god and one is playing at a god, which I think are two distinctly different actions.
Well, Veidt, meanwhile, this smartest man in the world, this king among men, as you so say, which I agree with, believes that he understands mankind the most. Now, playing God, he hatches a plan to make mankind's worst impulse, which is fear, as a way to goad them into world peace. When Veidt reveals that his scheme, which is using the alien monster to kill half of New York City, appears to have averted the looming nuclear war by frightening those world governments into cooperation, Dr. Manhattan also realizes that to expose this scheme would be too dangerous for all life on Earth. Like, it would just create more chaos, and ultimately we would obliterate each other. So he goes along with Veidt's plan. These two gods both believe that while maybe they didn't take the same path, ultimately salvation occurs. And so at the end of Watchmen, when Dr. Manhattan decides to leave Earth again, he says he might return one day. Now, Veidt is surprised by that, pointing out that Dr. Manhattan really never cared about human. Why this renewed interest? To which Dr. Manhattan says, well, you know what? Maybe I'm going to go off. I'm going to go to Europa. I'm going to go to these other worlds. I'm going to create some new life. And when Veidt asks, because we know that he's omniscient and can see the what we perceive as the past, present, and future all at one, he asks, well, does this plan work out in the end? Dr. Manhattan says, well, nothing really ever ends. So that takes us to the events of episode 8. We see both these men, God saviors, that are disenfranchised in this Eden that they've both created. Ozzy sits in front of his screens all day, watching over his paradise, bothered by their constant need to want to destroy themselves, while dropping or transporting, whatever you want to call it, these genetically created squid over areas of the Earth, not just Tulsa, as a way to delicately keep this peace amongst world. He's playing squid whack-a-mole.
Again, I think one is a god amongst men story, and the other is more of a monkey's paw story. Ozymandias is this guy who got the thing that he wanted and ultimately found out it wasn't a fulfilling thing. So I don't think it's two god figures. It's one guy who is a god and one guy who got what he wished for and regrets it.
But when you think about it, John also got bored of his creations. He's created this ultimate paradise on Europa, where only creations live to serve him. When you think of theology, when you think of the way that mankind has used religion, it was a way to control people that say, hey, you have to live this certain way. And if you live this way, you're serving God. When in actuality, if you truly achieve that as a God, if there's no drama, much like television shows, we get bored quickly. There's even a sex joke that says, in Genesis, it took 7 days. And Angela asks, well, did you rest on Sunday? He's like, no, I did it in 90 seconds. And she makes a joke and says, oh, just like a man, you come in 90 seconds and then you want nothing to do with me right afterwards. But again, after spending years as a glowing God, he misses those easily overlooked virtues of humanity, such as love, which is why Veidt asks him, why did you come back? It must have been for a girl. Now, in the same vein, Veidt also quickly grew bored of his existence amongst those people of Europa because, like Dr. Manhattan, he grows bored of being served. He wants to be needed. He's trying to get back to Earth in all its imperfect glory. He says, heaven doesn't need me, to Adam, or to Adam Phillips. He says this because having realized that, while he hated humankind's self-destructive nature, and it's in our nature to self-destruct, he loved being that person or that God or that savior that people turn to solve their problems, which, if we turn to Western religion, that person is Jesus. The unfortunate creations of Europa, however, are just like how we would be if a prophet-like individual walked amongst us. We tie them up, we'd smash tomatoes in their face, or worse, we tie them up to a crucifix and stab them with stabby points, which is the whole story of Jesus and how the Romans took him down. They did this trial, this perverted trial, which at the end of the day they knew they were going to be guilty. That's why they bring in these pigs. It's a perverted sense of justice. But at the end of it, both men experience these prisons of their own creations. And I wonder if the message is that ultimately we cannot control life. Humanity is imbued with this idea of free will, that series of random thermodynamic small miracles that each day, for right or wrong, create life. I follow this woman at Joelle Monique. I'm going to shout her out because she wrote in the recap of episode 8 that the greatness of humanity is enduring despite knowing immense and unavoidable pain lies around the corner of every perfect moment. And if you stop to think about that for a second, the things that bind us to the people that we're closest to, be they lovers, be they friends, be their family, are so random in nature of how we got there, of why we're connected to them, that those are really the true miracles of life. And so that connection, I truly believe, as a non-practicing Catholic, is that idea of God, that God is that love that binds us together.
This is the positive side of a two-sided coin, right? Where on one hand, you have this optimistic outlook of the God is love. On the flip side of it, it is that idea of that immense and unavoidable pain around every corner, which powers concepts like malaise and really litters the work of Damon Lindelof and Alan Moore, right? Now, this might be a more optimistic take on the messaging they've always had. Alan Moore is a known occultist. He believes that it's dangerous to believe in a God that would do something as grand as creating a universe. Damon Lindelof, on the other hand, he's like, yeah, I believe in a God, but maybe not the God in the way that people typically think of it, because how could you justify a God that would allow such atrocities to happen? And so you've got these prolific creators and creative masterminds who are giving us a view of life that directly mirrors what you're explaining here, Raj. And I think it's just a way of how different people digest it, right? So there's either a positive view that these connections that we form are a miracle and that God is love. And there's the negative view, which is that there is no lasting satisfaction. And that's what motivates man. And so it's really interesting to see them come together in a fucking TV show.
Raj, that was really great momentum. You really drove through all that. That's a lot of great information that you pushed through.
Thanks, man.
And now it's the King Bee's turn. So I asked the King Bee to take a moment and tell us what we saw in the post-credits scene. Again, some people never saw it. I do encourage you to go back and watch it. A lot of people wrote in and said, hey, what the fuck? You didn't talk about Ozymandias on Europa post credits and his interaction with the game warden. And so I'm going to pass it over to King B to talk about what we saw there and the possible significance.
So if you stuck around towards the end credits there, what happens is you get the voiceover, you get some Phillips's and some Crookshanks's, and you hear their voices, and they ask, "Will you stay?" And you hear Ozymandias say no. It cuts to his face. You see a Crookshanks's. She says, "Will you stay?" He says no, and she smashes a tomato from a tree in his face. And it looks like there's a line of them. They're all lined up to do this. Now, there's a few different ways that you can perceive this. Obviously, it does look like he's sort of crucified here. The way they're delivering this line, "Will you stay?" It's meant to be a punishment. But I don't feel that any of these characters or these creatures are really taking joy in this. I think they're almost asking him if he'll stay so that they can stop doing what they are doing. If you were going to follow the sort of Christ analogy, much like he was tormented on the cross with spears, they are sort of tormenting him, but they're not, I think, willing to do physical harm to him. So maybe this form of humiliation is supposed to take its place. Even this, they aren't real excited to do, it seems. What we know so far about Europa and the Denzians that reside is that the game warden was the atom of Manhattan's creation. That all these beings are these meek, subservient, benevolent creatures, with the exception of the game warden, who kicks him in the face and isn't afraid to humiliate and maybe do a little bit of physical harm there. Strangely, we don't ever see his Eve. And this leads me to wonder if this is part of a reason for his sort of singular animosity, or why he acts differently than the other creations. Gosh, I'd really like to know if that's the case. I don't know if we're going to get the opportunity. But this whole thing, to me, is sort of the O. Henry fable. Ozymandias goes to great lengths to create a peaceful utopia on Earth. Through all those manipulations, he's forced to sort of live in reclusivity. There's no glory for his actions. He never gets to be celebrated as the hero of mankind. And it starts to wear a little bit thin on him. Manhattan shows up. They have their little talk, and he says, "Hey, I've been working on this thing. I think it's a little bit closer to what you wanted. Why don't you go check it out?" And Ozymandias jumps on it. He'd love to see a utopia. When he gets there, he finds it to be really dull and unfulfilling. And ultimately, I think what he's getting here is a gift from Manhattan. It's not a punishment. It's not an imprisonment. It's hey, this is the thing that you're after. Here's the perspective. This is what I see.
I never really thought about it that way, but if you think of Ozymandias, despite being imprisoned, despite being driven like near mad over 7 years of captivity, he seems a lot more invigorated than he did when he was on Earth, right? The last scene we see him on Earth, he's just kind of lounging in the chair. He's gripping his hair. He's so just bored with everything. It's almost like Dr. Manhattan brought him new life, that new perspective kind of recharged his batteries. It's like the best vacation you could get.
Again, comparing this to at least Western religion and Christianity, maybe, again, if you wanted to compare Ozzy to a Jesus-like figure, and there were some hints and visual cues that could be, didn't God send Jesus down here to, like, almost as a lesson? The first 30 years, he sent him through these series of different challenges that he had to go through, these painful experiences, ultimately to become the savior. And so maybe that's, if you were to try to draw analogies between religion and God and what they're trying to say here, maybe this is Dr. Manhattan's test to get Ozzy to be that savior of humanity.
Again, I don't know if it's a test so much as a gift of perspective. Sure. If you think about like every single working mom, she's stuck in that paradox where these moms, these parents, they need a break so badly from their screaming, needy children. Ultimately, though, they love those kids, and that's the reason that they toil as much as they do. And that bond can't ever be severed. Ozzy needed a break to remind himself of what and why he's doing what he does. Europa provides no struggle. It's an existence without purpose. And Ozymandias feels, and I think sees, he lives for 7 years this life of this lack of purpose, And I think that's going to drive him to come back to Earth and renew his vigor for the works he's been doing.
Yeah, if this ties to a bigger idea, I think it ties back to why any of these masked vigilantes do what they do. King B pointed out, with Will Reeves. Will Reeves had an anger inside of him that propelled his actions. Yes, they were triggered by the hardship that he faced and by some real fucking scumbags in New York City. But the fact is that every single one of these heroes that doesn't have superpowers is motivated by a sort of selfish need. And in that sense, Ozymandias, if his actions were just to set the world on a straight path to peace and harmony and perfection, well, he just got that handed to him on a silver platter. It's not what he wanted, which is a clear indicator that, again, goes back to the idea King B had, which is that these people are selfishly motivated by some internal need that can't be satisfied by any win.
Well, speaking of being handed things on a silver platter, B, we talked a little bit about this in the Instacast, the fact that he's handed this horseshoe totem in the cake, the 7th anniversary cake. It's obvious that maybe he's going to use this to escape, but what are your thoughts on this horseshoe?
I don't want to get yelled at for saying this is how I think it ought to be or what have you. But if I was in a writer's room tasked with writing this out, this is what I would throw up on the Peteypedia files or what have you. That horseshoe started showing up in episode 1, and it always seems to be lingering throughout the series in all of these scenes with Ozymandias. Imagine the concept that Manhattan is able to observe all that happens throughout all of time. If you were able to reduce the scale of that world to a much smaller microcosm, could it be that Ozymandias, the greatest human mind, might be able to set into motion events on a smaller scale, a modified sort of version of being able to see through time? If he were to set an object into motion, anticipating its end result, maybe that's how the horseshoe arrives baked inside of a cake. It's a perfect prison escape cliche for a culture that is sort of reared on these sort of television and fictional adventure type things. When you see Ozymandias discover the horseshoe, the fact that he cannot contain his glee, to me, it's almost a vibe as if he somehow had planned this whole thing from soup to nuts, and possibly seeing that horseshoe there is evidence that his greater machinations are starting to play out. A Manhattan scale perspective on the situation or the world in which he lives. This is his sort of Crookshanks redemption.
I mean, it would make sense of why he didn't put together his own defense on trial. It's not like he's in prison because he couldn't figure a way out. He definitely could. I bet you he could put on a defense that would wow everyone in the courtroom and they'd be dumbfounded. He could have said, "Yeah, I'm going to stay. Just like let me go." Right? There's a reason why he's going through all of this, and so I couldn't quite figure that out. This is a reasonable explanation that the fact of the matter is it's part of his plan, a plan he wasn't certain was going to work, but it finally came through.
And that ability to sort of track that lone horseshoe from start to finish, you could almost see that as sort of a way that he perceives Manhattan's ability to see through time.
Man, we got really deep on this episode. This is deeper than we've ever gone on the deep dive.
Yeah, I'd be interested to see how much of it anybody listened to. If you did stick around, here's some tasty morsels for you. Now, each of those was a massive chunk, but we got some little tidbits here, just some odds and ends that Raj put together that we wanted to touch on. Again, these don't really fit into any of the major buckets. They're not even necessarily significant, but it's fun, and that's what TV should be. So, Raj, take it away with your odds and ends.
You mentioned on the Instacast that you didn't really care for the voice and of Dr. Manhattan when his face isn't shown to when Cal becomes Dr. Manhattan. And I actually read into this. Both versions of Dr. Manhattan are actually played by Yahya Abdul-Mateen. They just used a little bit of voice modulation in post to make his voice seem a little bit different, but it's actually the same actor who's portraying Dr. Manhattan.
That explains why I didn't like it. I don't like artificial voices.
That's right. You also talking about Dr. Manhattan when Angela is presenting him with the options for him to be to transform into their likeness. For a show about race relations, I thought it was interesting that Angela first shows Dr. Manhattan both white and Asian men first, only showing Cal's body after he says she should feel most comfortable with the body of her choosing. So I guess the question I have to ask you guys, could this speak to society's view of how we envision God? And especially in Western society and here in America, we always view God as a white dude. And then, or could it just be fanboys' reaction to having a black actor portraying Dr. Manhattan?
I don't think it's either of those things. I think it's a much more simpler explanation. I think she's just providing less than desirable options because she's resistant to being told you're going to fall in love with me. She's throwing a monkey wrench into the plan by intentionally providing options that maybe she's not into. And that's why she's keeping the good stuff in reserve, because maybe she's just not quite ready to just go jumping on a dead man's blue dong.
Did anybody find it weird that she meets a guy in a bar and she's like, sure, let's go to the morgue and look at the body? Like, that seems very unprofessional to me.
To be fair, how many times did you make out in a graveyard in your high school days?
Yeah, but it wasn't in a professional duty. I wasn't a cop.
Well, they're on a date.
And there's a difference between a graveyard and a morgue.
Yeah, about 4 feet.
Also, I noticed that Veidt at the end in that final scene, he is reading the book Fog Dancing. I did talk about how Fog Dancing was also written by the author of The Black Freighter and how Veidt's story has become the Black Freighter of this series. I didn't realize, and I had to go back and I had to read this, and it was brought up by a lot of review websites, is that Fog Dancing is also featured on the patio of episode 4. Ma Clark is actually reading Fog Dancing, and that Fog Dancing, the author Max Shea, was actually taken to the island by Veidt when he was working on the alien psychic squid. And Fog Dancing, the story, talks about how the only way to be reborn is by dying, and which seems to be like, again, another biblical or a reference to Dr. Manhattan. And then finally, the last piece of odds and ends is, did you guys notice that at the end it says episode 9, the season finale, not the series finale, which HBO, I think, pays attention to, because they did say for the final episode of Silicon Valley, which came after Watchmen, it said series finale. So this can't be coincidence. I just wanted to know what you guys think. Do you really believe this series is over, or do you think, or do you even want a season 2?
I'm going to take a very Manhattan stance on this. Doesn't make a difference if there's a season 2 or not. It's the same amount of particles in the universe. You know what? This is a great television show. It's been very enjoyable to watch. I wouldn't be hurt if there was a one and done, because, nothing lasts forever. So, what do you want? Season 8 with dragons and shit showing up? No, I'm happy with a one and done.
I'm a fan of the British way of doing TV, which is like 3 seasons tops, but really just tell the story and be done with it. And in particular, I like series that already know the arc and know when they're going to stop, right? I referenced Carnival. Although Carnival ended abruptly, that is a series I would have liked to see more seasons of, because it had an arc that needed to be completed and it was cut short. Deadwood, I think, was another example where it had an arc and needed to be cut short. But if you have a complete story that you can tell it. Now, what I could see, and we said this, I think, before this series even started, was something like a True Detective, where it's an anthology sort of thing. I could definitely see that, but not if they keep having to bring characters, back in. That would be a little bit rough. But I don't know how they're going to keep up this level of quality, to be honest with you, as far as storytelling goes. And I'm pretty exhausted after one season. So if they are going to do it, HBO, please at least wait like 2 years. Let us get through Westworld season 3. Yeah, maybe then we can go back to it.
No lube, man.
King B wants it's just going to be the Red Scare and Pirate Jenny solving crimes. That's all it's going to be. Actually, not even solving crimes, just eating.
I'd be up for that.
My favorite absolute high point of this show is Red Scare eating and going, tell her, fuck you.
I need more Don Johnson in my life.
She's under fucking arrest.
Well, Roger's little show called Miami Vice. It's got both Florida and Don Johnson. You got to check it out. Your 2 favorite things.
And cocaine. My 3 favorite things.
I just want to hear the podcast as Roger talking about all the biblical references in Miami Vice.
As a child, my aunt used to dress me up as Don Johnson, and she put like a fake beard on me and dressed me up in pastel t-shirts. And
How old were you when this was happening?
I was like 6 or 7.
Dude, we have to compare photos because when I was like 5 or 6 years old, I used to dress up as Don Johnson from Miami Vice.
Or
my thoughts on what it was, what he looked like.
Yeah, it was either Don Johnson in Miami Vice or Weird Al Yankovic in the Fat Video.
My mom dressed me up as a witch every Halloween. It's
I
fucking humiliating.
She was trying to tell you something about your heritage and legacy.
The legacy.
Yeah, it was the witch girl from the Miller High Life logo. Is really what it was. That's the legacy.
Sexy witch girl.
Yeah, that's good.
All right. Well, that concludes this week's episode of Shat on TV Watchmen. Be sure to follow us on social media and share with a friend. We're on Twitter, Snapchat, and Instagram at Shat on TV. On Facebook, just search for Shat on TV Podcasts. The website is shatontv.com. If you would like to write in for our newsstand that comes out later this week, that is our mailbag edition. We've already got some of the strongest email we've had all season, so the competition is fierce, but there's still time to get in at hosts@shatontv.com, or once again, you can call in a voicemail at 914-719-SHAT. Let us hear from you. Let us get to know you. Roger's done a fantastic job launching our new and improved Shat on TV and Shat the Movie store, where you can find tons of merch. He's done a great job writing all the descriptions and designing some pretty cool shit.
Yeah, and there's stuff from artists depicting Gene holding up a giant dog. We have Roger's Awesome World. We have a shirt that says Zero Wipes for fans of Shat the Movies. We even have an Abernathy Farms for fans of Westworld that didn't get their chance to get that shirt when we released it a few years ago. My favorite stuff is actually the King Bee items that are on there. There's everything from t-shirts to coffee mugs to tote bags. There's a visualization of a young Dick Ebert with his infamous catchphrase, "Good evening," and he looks like a young serial killer. So there's lots of fun merchandise. Go on there. Again, you can, between now and the end of the year, use promo code SHAT20, the number 20, SHAT20, to receive 20% off all your purchases. And again, we're talking like $25 for a t-shirt or $12 for a coffee mug, or you can buy some stickers and put them on your Hydro Flask. Again, it's not a lot of money. We're not making a ton of money off of it, but the good thing is we don't have to buy a bunch of stuff, take pre-orders, and then mail it out 3 months from now. All of this, and the great thing about Teespring, which is hosts us, they do all the fulfillment and the printing on demand, so you can get your shirts within a timely fashion. So go check it out. We'll put the link here in the show notes, as well as you can visit any of our websites, shatontv.com or shatthemovies.com, or check Twitter. Thanks.
Yeah, and I'll also go ahead and create a redirect for you guys. So if you go to shatontv.com/merch, it'll take you straight to the shop. Our first day of sales with the discount code on. Off with a bang. I think we made $8 today.
Woo! Yeah, that was my mom. I think she ordered 4 of the Roger's Awesome World shirts.
Thanks, Mrs. Roeper.
Hand them out. Yeah, thanks, Mrs. Roeper. Thanks, Mom.
Well, wherever fine podcasts can be found, including iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Pandora, Spotify, and YouTube, be sure to subscribe. And if you stop by iTunes, please leave a review. That helps the podcast grow. If you call King B a racist, he will stop being on the podcast. So don't do that. On behalf of my co-hosts, the King Bee and Roger Roeper, I'm Gene Lyons. Be sure to join us later this week for the Shat on TV Watchmen newsstand, our mailbag edition. And then join us Sunday for our Instacast for episode 9, the final episode, See How They Fly.
They can call me a racist. They just can't call me a fanboy.